why don't you guys can sit down now, and I'll invite you guys in. Want to do that? So, it's literally crazy. So we're going to introduce, have you guys met Cheryl yet? Hi. Cheryl's one of the trustees on our foundation. So this is completely funded by our foundation. So Cheryl's going to talk a little bit about the foundation, just a little bit. We're going to sing the hymn, and then after the hymn, I'll invite you guys up. When I move over to the chairs, you guys can come up. Okay, cool. Great. Cool. All right. Thanks for having us. Good plan. We're so glad you're here. So good. Chuck could make it. Laura could make it. Yeah. So this is our committee.
Well, I'm glad I'm here.
Isn't that fun?
You know, I've known Laura from different activities over the years. One of her kids is probably the same age as me.
Okay.
But I never met Chuck. So it's nice getting to know people in small groups.
I agree. That's like I honestly think that it's my favorite part about committee work. It's just, it's like a small group. You get to know people in ways that you couldn't otherwise. So, all right. Well, I'm going to get us going here.
Right?
People are here.
And it's a good turnout.
It is. You know, we had 160 people RSVP. So I think, people will be coming. They'll come tonight or tomorrow.
Yeah, maybe people will just, like my husband's just going to come.
Great. Great. All right. We'll get going. Good evening. It's good to see you all here tonight. I want to welcome you to this year's Foundation Lectures. Whether you're a Covenant member or a friend or a visitor, I'm just glad that you're here. Welcome. My name is John Wasson. I serve as the Associate Pastor of Discipleship here at Covenant. The Foundation Lectures grew out of a desire from our Discipleship Committee to bring Christian authors and speakers to our campus so that we could spend more time than we normally might have digging into some deeper issues of our faith. So we put together a proposal for a multi-year lecture series, and with the support of our session, we asked the foundation here at Covenant to fund that series. And the fact that we're here tonight tells you that they said yes to that, and then they didn't pull our funding after we had our first one just a couple of years ago. We're really grateful to the foundation for their support that makes this possible. And as Laura Tuma, who serves on our committee, actually as the chair of our steering committee, said a few years ago, naming these lectures after the foundation is meant both to honor their support, but it's also to reflect our desire for this weekend to, and all the lectures to come really, to explore the foundational issues of faith that really apply to each and every one of us, regardless of the circumstances of our lives or how long we've been followers of Jesus. It's with a firm foundation that we grow and mature and flourish as individual followers of Jesus as well as the church. And because none of this would be possible, like I said, without the support of the foundation, I just want to invite Foundation trustee Cheryl Brown, who's also on our steering committee, to tell us just briefly a little bit about the work of the foundation. So, Cheryl.
See a lot of familiar faces. How many people knew that Covenant had a foundation? Good, that's great, that's wonderful. Well, on behalf of the foundation, welcome. I'm going to give you just a little bit of history. It was founded in 1998 as a nonprofit charitable organization after a longtime Covenant member passed away and left a bequest of $1 million. The member wanted to benefit the church and saw a foundation as a way to ensure that financial support would be available for projects and activities that were beyond the church's annual budget. Many of the donations since that time that have been made are from bequests or are given in memory of Covenant members. Currently, the foundation has $1.4 million. The funds are managed for long-term growth to ensure that the foundation will continue for many generations. And in 24 years, the foundation has granted $1.3 million to benefit the Covenant community. And some examples of some of the things that have the foundation has been able to do: help the church retire debt in 2006, 2011, and 14. grant office equipment for the New Covenant Fellowship, provide pastoral housing funds to help offset Austin's high cost of living, and purchase other items directly for the church, such as the sanctuary Bibles. And additionally, in 2015, the foundation began educating church members about a theologically sound approach to estate planning, end-of-life issues, and other money matters. And we began funding this speaker series in 2019. So I hope you enjoy this weekend's very timely discussion. Thank you.
I'm very pleased to introduce our speakers for tonight and tomorrow. John Inazu is the Sally D. Danforth Distinguished Professor of Law and Religion at Washington University in St. Louis, where he teaches criminal law, religion and law, and various First Amendment courses. He writes and he speaks frequently to general audiences on topics of pluralism, assembly, free speech, religious freedom, among other things. He's the author of Liberty's Refuge, The Forgotten Freedom of Assembly, Confident Pluralism, Surviving and Thriving Through Deep Difference. And he's the co-editor with Tim Keller of Uncommon Ground, Living Faithfully in a World of Difference. And Confident Pluralism, as well as Uncommon Ground, is in the back for you to purchase this weekend if you'd like. Tish Harrison Warren is a priest in the Anglican Church in North America and is currently the writer-in-residence at Resurrection here in South Austin. She's the author of Liturgy of the Ordinary, Sacred Practices in Everyday Life, which you might remember if you are part of our congregation. We read a few years ago during Lent. And Prayer in the Night, for those who work or watch or weep. Tish brings years of experience working as a campus minister and associate rector in parishes, as well as experience working across nonprofit organizations as well. She's, I think, a monthly columnist with the Christianity Today. Is that still current? Okay. And the New York Times publishes her weekly newsletter, which is very good and entirely worth the subscription to the New York Times. So I know some of you get that. I would highly recommend it. Both John and Tish are dedicated to helping Christians live as faithful followers of Jesus Christ during a time of deep division. And that will be the theme of our time this weekend. The question we'll be exploring together comes from this book that John co-edited with Tim Keller, and both John and Tish contributed to that book as well. And the question is this: how can Christians interact with those around them in ways that show respect to those whose beliefs are radically different while remaining faithful to the gospel? Which is a very relevant question that we all need to find an answer to. So tonight, in just a few minutes, we'll begin with a conversation between John and Tish. They're going to interview each other. I'm tasked with stepping in when I need to, apparently. Keeping track of time and keeping us on task. They'll interview each other about their respective chapters in this book, Uncommon Ground, and we'll leave some time at the end for interaction and questions from you as well. Tomorrow, we'll get to learn a little bit about this approach to our culture that John calls confident pluralism, and then Tish will respond to that. There was an early title of that lecture by Tish is Everything That John Inazu is Wrong About, so I highly encourage you to come back for that tomorrow. It should be entertaining at the least. We're thrilled that Tish and John accepted our invitation way back in 2020 and stuck to that answer through a global pandemic. It's very good. It's very good to be here together tonight, to learn together. I believe that God has called us here this weekend to learn, and to learn something that might help us better navigate the strange world that we find ourselves in. So I invite you to pray with me, and then we'll sing a hymn, and we'll dive in. Let's pray. Holy God, we give you thanks. We give you thanks for being here tonight, for the ability to gather in this space, for the generosity of our foundation and all those who have given to it. And we give you thanks for John and Tish, who accepted our invitation to be our teachers. Be gracious to us as we listen and learn about your call to us in this time and place. Deepen our comprehension of the gospel. broaden our thinking, and use this time that we have together to transform us, that we might be your faithful servants as we go from here. We ask all of this in the name of your Son, who is our example in all things. Amen.
Amen. We're going to be singing Be Thou My Vision. You're welcome to join along in our hymnals. It's number 502. Or you're welcome to just listen. Be thou my vision, O Lord of my heart, not be all else to me, save that thou art. Thou my best thought by day or by night, waking or sleep, my presence, my life. Be thou my wisdom, be thou my true word. I ever with thee, and thou with me, Lord. Thou my great Father, and I thy true Son. High King of heaven, my treasure thou art. High King of heaven, my victory won. May I reach heaven's joys, O bright heaven's sun. Heart of my own heart, whatever befall, still be my vision, O ruler of all.
It's Jerry. Hey, guys.
Hi.
Hi. So,
Can I just start by saying I never have my smartphone when I'm presenting, but
Yeah.
I have questions for John on it. So don't think that I'm like bored and texting other people or
if
checking-
you tweet, we will know.
checking. I'm live. I will be live tweeting John.
Great. Subtweeting him while we're doing this. So I mentioned this book, Uncommon Ground, John, that you and Tim edited and put together, that you have a chapter in. Tish, you have a chapter in it as well. And I'm just wondering if we could begin tonight by talking about this project. Where did it come from? Why did you and Tim decide to put it together the way that you did? What were you trying to accomplish?
Yeah, thanks. It's great to be with all of you and great to be in person. You asked a professor to say, where did this come from? So I'm going to start at the very, very beginning and
Great.
work forward. But my own, I'm a law professor, focuses on the First Amendment, and my own sort of narrow niche expertise is on the right of assembly in the First Amendment. And when I was in graduate school, going through a bunch of legal opinions, it occurred to me that the right of assembly is the only one of the 5 individual rights in the First Amendment that requires more than one person to be exercised. So you can speak, petition, in some faiths you can practice religion, and you can be the press by yourself, but you can't assemble alone. It requires, by definition, more than one person. And so part of the historical constitutional argument that I built was the idea that right from the get-go, Madison and the other founders understood that we existed in society, not just as individuals, but as groups, and that groups mattered. And the more I wrote and reflected on that, those groups also lead to a lot of differences. So we have distinct, Madison called them factions. We have distinct factions and groups in society where we don't all agree and we don't all get along. And so the thought continued to develop that there's something about the way that we have to figure out how to live as different groups in the same political space without killing each other, basically. And so that's what I started speaking and writing more on. And then I met Tim Keller along the way. And in some discussions with Tim, it became clear that what he was preaching as a evangelical Presbyterian in New York City was quite similar to what I was writing about in my own academic circles. And we realized we were saying very similar themes in very different registers. So we thought, is there a way to bring this together? It first started with an article, and then after we wrote the article together, we thought, there's more here. Why don't we think about a book specifically for Christians to think through? Most of my arguments had been just for any American citizen who cares about the country in accessible language that wasn't sectarian or theological. But Tim and I both thought there's a very distinctive Christian argument here that we want Christians to embrace. And so we thought of this book, and then we thought we don't want to just be didactic and preachy to people. We want to demonstrate with stories, the stories of our lives. But our lives were kind of relatively boring on their own, so we thought we need to bring in friends and others who are doing this in their own lives, people who are much cooler than us, like Tish and others, to bring to life the theory, the theology, the ideas onto the pages of a book that would be sharing their lives with other people. So that was the idea, and we went through, spent a lot of time trying to figure out who should be part of this, and ended up with 10 friends. And that's how we got going. I will say, the one thing Tim and I insisted on early was if you accepted our invitation to be part of this book, you had to come to St. Louis, where we were going to meet in person as a whole group and invest in each other as people and not just writers for an edited volume. So, and by a miracle of God, every author got to St. Louis. Some of them had very busy schedules, and we sat around at a dinner table for 3 hours just sharing some of our stories with each other. And that was, to me, that was the moment that transformed this book into a collective ministry effort and not just 12 people writing.
I'm going to get out of the way as best as I can and just kind of disappear and just be here for pictures.
You're well positioned for that.
But for those, yeah, I mean, that's basically why I'm here.
Just a pretty
Reputation. So before I let you guys kind of talk about, because you both talk about the role that you play, you as translator, you as writer, and how you're doing that, trying to accomplish what you're getting at in the book. For those of us who haven't read the book, I've read the book. For those of them who haven't read the book, imagine if I had not read the book and I was sitting here right now. Summarize at least what you're trying to do.
Yeah, I mean, so the subtitle is Living Faithfully in a World of Difference, and we wanted to say, how is it that Christians can be authentically Christian, not compromising, not hiding the ball about what we believe, but also be gracious with those who differ from us and who we find sometimes uncomfortable or wrong or even morally wrong, but how do we love them as neighbors? And also, how do we live in a world that we might not control? So there's this gradual movement happening right now in American Christianity where a lot of people, I'll talk some about this tomorrow as well, but where people who just assumed that what they believed and what they knew was the baseline about which everyone else would figure out and adjust to. And that's just not the case anymore in 2021. And so there's this sense in which American Christianity is trying to figure out, what does it mean to be a faithful witness in a world we don't control? And that was part of the idea. And so then when we lined up these authors, 12 of us total, we thought, to frame the storytelling and to frame the examples, can we give each person a role or a title to unpack? And so as the editor, I chose the one I wanted for myself, the translator, to see my life's work in many ways as that of a translator, and basically to say, what does it mean as a person, as a professional, to be engaged in the work of translation? Tim got the role of the pastor, which he took, and then we had others. We had some musicians who were artists and storytellers.
I will say that it's worth noting, the editors chose everybody else's title too.
Absolutely,
so
yeah.
I didn't pick, he picked his, but
it was very top down, but it was done with prayer and discernment. And so with Tish, we said, we want you to be the writer, and she immediately said, well, I can't represent all writers everywhere. And we said, you don't have to. You just have to talk about yourself. But I mean, and partly because Tim and I had both known Tish for a long time. She is a beautiful and compelling writer, and we thought that she could bring to life that which we were trying to accomplish through the craft and the role of writing. And I actually think in hindsight that a lot of this was kind of trying to put puzzle pieces together, but the roles that we ended up giving people were really, I think they really worked out well. Claude Alexander, who's an African-American pastor in Charlotte, North Carolina, we gave him the role of the peacemaker, and his whole life is a life of peacemaking in really hard situations. And so it wasn't our doing all up front, but I think it really came together in that way.
It ended up, this is neither here nor there in terms of talking about uncommon ground, the concept, sort of pluralism or any of that, but it, just side note, it ended up kind of strangely prophetic in some ways, because you assigned me writer, and I was a writer at the time. I mean, I had a book out, but I was also a pastor, so I did note, like, hey, Tim, I'm a pastor too. And they were like, well, Tim had been a pastor his whole life, so he's like, you're the writer. But at that point, like, I mean, since then, my writing career is really, I mean, I write now as a full-time job. I write for the New York Times. That's my gig. But you sort of named that before that was. You saw my future somehow in a way that I didn't.
Prophetic.
Maybe it's you.
He should have been prophet, not translator.
That'll be the sequel.
Yeah. Y'all take it away.
So John, I'll start. I can ask you the first question. So you named yourself the translator. Can you tell us what you mean by that? And what does it mean to be a translator? How did you become one? Talk to me about what you mean, because you don't mean that necessarily that you speak multiple languages.
Not necessarily. That's true. No, but this reminds me actually. The punchline of the book, which I should flag here, is we actually see God as embodying all of these roles for us. God is translator, God is writer, God is peacemaker, God is reconciler, God is pastor, theologian, and so we're trying to reflect a piece of that. But it comes together, I think, and I thought of that as you were asking me the question, because I'm not just, you're not just a writer, you're a pastor. I'm not just a translator. I've got other tricks up my sleeve too. But
Prophet,
thank you. Yes, we're naming for each other here. So in the frame of being a translator, what I mean by that is I'm trained as a lawyer. I practiced law for 4 years, and as a practitioner, my whole job, and some of you might be lawyers, your job is to make coherent these witnesses who cannot by themselves, you're an advocate, they cannot by themselves convey what needs to be conveyed to these powerful judges or decision makers. And sometimes, in my case, my witnesses were brilliant engineers and physicists who were working on complex systems, but they couldn't explain why what they were doing mattered. And so my job was to work really hard to figure out, what are you talking about, and can we put this into simple terms for this judge who needs to understand why this matters. And so I was trained as a translator in that way. And then when I moved into teaching, I realized teaching has much of these same skill sets as advocacy. Every year I get this new group of students in. I teach half law students and half undergraduates, but with law students in particular, they don't know anything about the law. And I have to work to figure out what I've been doing for a lot of years and simplify it in a way that makes sense to them where they are. And if I forget, so that means two things. One, it means I've got to really know my subject matter. I mean, if you don't, when you try to teach something, you realize whether you know something or not. So I have to really know it well. And there were times in my career early on when I maybe didn't know it so well, but I learned trial and error, and now I know very well what I teach. But I also have to know my audience very well. And if, as a teacher, I forget that these students sitting in front of me are not the same students as the year before or 5 years before, if I just think I can phone it in without actually figuring out who they are, then I'm going to fail at translating. I can be the smartest person in the room, I can know exactly the subject matter, but if I'm not able to convey it to other people, then it's lost. And then, and this is sort of the move I make in the chapter, is to say, and as Christians, every single one of us is called to be a translator. We might not have a particular vocational expertise, but in the people we meet in the world with our neighbors, our coworkers, our friends, we are, as Christ's ambassadors, standing in his place, representing the kingdom of God to people around us. And so that means we should know what we're talking about and know what we believe. or else we're not going to be effective translators. And we have to know the audience to whom we're communicating. And I think especially a lot of American Christians some of them struggle with knowing, and they just don't know what they believe. But some of them also struggle with forgetting to understand the audience and just assuming that they're going to be heard or understood, and without the slow work of earning both the credibility to be heard and then also the capacity to translate.
Mm-hmm. Do you, so what, in terms of, you're talking about us knowing the gospel, knowing the good news of Jesus, and then being able to say that to people in a way that they can hear, that makes sense to them, right? So are there, I guess I'm curious, do you feel like there are limits to that work? In other words, are there things about the gospel that can't be translated, or do you feel like there's, I guess I'm asking if there's limits to the work. What are the challenges to translators? Like, what makes that hard?
Well,
And are there places it can't go? I mean, are there things that, I'm actually asking this somewhat as a writer too. I write for a largely secular audience. Like, are there things that I can't say to them, do you think, about the gospel?
I think that, I don't know if there are things you can't say, but there are probably things that can't be understood. So part of, I think, one of the baked-in premises about the way I see the world is it matters. This goes back to the assembly group stuff, but when you get into an actual lived group, a church or whatever it is, a community that does stuff together, you start doing things that you can really only fully understand from the inside. So people out there who look at the church, and they might think you're weird to take communion or to sing songs or even to show up on Sundays. And if you weren't in a sorority, you might look at a sorority and think, that looks like a waste of time, or whatever it is, competitive athletics, whatever it is, you can't fully understand what's going on the inside unless you're actually a participant. And that limits the ability to translate fully. I think you can still use examples and analogies, and part of what I think our role as Christians is to demonstrate as best we can God's love for us without putting all of the pressure on ourselves to sort of close the deal. Like, if we really believe in the Holy Spirit as part of this, then God is going to do God's work, and that means there might be a gap in what we can communicate, and that's okay. That's actually probably part of acknowledging dependence on God.
Absolutely. Right. I mean, ultimately, it is the Spirit that translates, right? And at the end of the day, it's the Holy Spirit that I mean, and you see this, right, in Scripture. I mean, people speak in tongues, and they hear in their own language, right? And so there is some sort of like actual translation work happening at Pentecost. And so I think we certainly participate in that, but I think you're saying that in the limits of that, God is yet at work.
And this is hardest for people like you and me, and I imagine many of you, because we are trained to write and trained to communicate and trained to believe that we can do it fully and effectively. Mm-hmm. So I'm often haunted by when the Apostle Paul writes, I come not with wise or persuasive words, but with fear and trembling and the power of the Spirit. And then I think, well, I've actually spent my whole life learning how to say wise and persuasive words. So what does that mean? Like, what does that mean for my own dependence? And I think you and I can fall into the trap of thinking it's on us to, if the communication is not effective, then we have somehow failed. And I don't think that's right either, particularly because of this sort of spiritual gap to the whole thing. It doesn't mean we shouldn't try, and we're compelled to try hard, but we might not always get there.
Yeah.
Can I jump in?
Yes, absolutely.
Great. With this role of translation, you talk about feeling like you've got 1 foot in, 1 foot out, but then how your mind changed about having 2 feet in both worlds. Can you talk a little bit about what that feels like?
Yeah.
I think anyone who's trying to translate what they believe, or if they're in one community but also find themselves in another community, feel that pull.
Yeah.
So what is that like, and what would you say to Christians who feel that tension of feeling like they're in a community and in another one and trying to reconcile that?
Yeah, so and in my case, these two worlds, I teach at Washington University, which is a very sort of elite-driven, not at all religious university with all, and from the university's perspective, there's often a vibe over there that thinks Christians are ignorant, stupid, backwards people. And then I go to a church in town that I also love, and the church thinks the university is full of bad people, and it's where liberal people make your kids lose their faith. And so I'm part of these two institutions that have such distrust for one another, but actually I really value them both, and I want them to be fully I want them both to flourish. Even though there are things about the university that I don't agree with and don't feel comfortable with, and there are things about my church that make me very uncomfortable. So I love both and see flaws in both, but in order to try to be a bridge between the two, I have to be able to, as much as I can, be all in with both of them. And so that's why in my chapter I talk about thinking originally I had one foot in the church and one foot in the university, but actually it's 2 feet in both worlds, which is of course not possible. But the idea is when you immerse yourself fully in love and critique and all of that, then you can more effectively try to bridge and explain. And it actually makes it, I think the hard part about that is then you're never fully at home in either place. And it's easier for me to think, okay, as a Christian, I'm not at home in the university. I get that. It's a lot harder to think, I don't fully feel at home in my church either, because they don't understand the university. They don't understand me sometimes. And so it makes you wonder, well, where is home then if I'm constantly translating? And so I think actually in some ways, and if you find yourself in that in between, it can start to feel lonely, which is then again another sort of call to community, to God, to prayer, and to the realization that this is not all on you as an individual.
There's a small university in Austin, and I know that there are faculty at that very little university down the street. We're a church, right, that has many faculty who attend and worship here. How do we help them not feel lonely when they're here? Or how do we enable them? What would you like someone to come to your church and tell them that they see you, the work you're doing, and feel supported and not so lonely? Is that possible, or is it just, are you bound to feel kind of torn?
No, I love that question. And I think that part of, and this is, I'll speak sort of from the position of a university professor, but this is true with a lot of aspects of, those of you who are in business or other areas of life, to start with a degree of grace for one another, to know that we didn't just kind of happen upon these spaces, but some of us feel very vocationally called to be there, and to trust that we are faithfully being salt and light in those places, which might look quite different than, say, if you're a pastor of a church. So I've had sometimes people critique me over the years and saying, well, why don't you have more of a gospel message in your classes? And I think, because I teach at Washington University, it'd be teaching malpractice for me to start a class with a gospel story. But I do want to be, I want my words to encourage and challenge people in my life and work there. And then for Christian students, I want them to be able to come to me and ask all of those gospel questions. And I want formation and discipleship to happen among the Christian students at Washington University or UT Austin. But it's just going to look different than, say, if we were at Wheaton or something like that.
So you talked about feeling lonely, and one of the questions I had that I mentioned to you the other day is that, so John and I, not to spoiler alert, but we're actual friends, in real life. We're good friends. We're good friends, and we hang out. He brought his wife down. They're gonna come hang out with us tomorrow. So more than most people I know, because I've sort of been around the world of Christian leaders and speakers, more than other folks, you are perhaps the most kind of fiercely committed to friendship and building relationships of people, of kind of Christian thought leaders in America right now. I think friendship, I look at your life and there's an incredible personal commitment to friendship, and you give time and money and effort and have John, I don't know, is it okay to share this? You don't know what I'm going to say. There's a group of guys that he's known since college that still get together, yearly or something? And they like make that commitment from all over the country and come together. And so, and then it struck me as you were even telling the story of Uncommon Ground that it began with a friendship between you and Tim Keller, and then it was really important to you that you made us friends with each other. That we were already friends. I didn't have a choice. He called me and was like, "You're going to be part of this book," kind of. So, but you wanted us to become friends with others, right? And so we gathered around this table, and then the next day we spent, I don't know, like some crazy amount of time, like 12 hours together, and it was sort of this like, everyone tell your most vulnerable moment. I mean, it was like church camp where you're all crying together, and we're gonna be friends. We sang, friends are friends forever, and cried. So.
I realized I reached the limit when I tried to give Lecrae a hug, and he wasn't really a hugging type. And I realized
Dude, Lecrae hugged me, so maybe it was personal. But so I feel like there's something about your response. There's something about your commitment there's something about you that's committed to friendship. But I think it's beyond that. I think there's something about the way you think about pluralism, but also sort of Christians being a faithful, creative, perhaps minority in a space and culture. Christians being a faithful presence. That I feel like friendship is high in kind of the register for you there. So can you explain, what does friendship have to do with Christian faithfulness in a pluralistic society? Why is friendship so important to you? Why did you care that we became friends to write about Uncommon Ground?
That's a very complex question. I'm trying to decide if we're going to go into therapy session or discussion here. But no,
Either way.
I think I have lots of thoughts. I'm not sure how they connect to pluralism and difference, but they might. So let me start actually by tagging back to John's question about how a church can care for university faculty. I've been around faculty for a long time, and as a generalization, we are high on ego and low on social skills, right? I mean, so that's another thing. Like, if you have faculty at your church, be kind to them because they don't know how to have normal conversations. But that feeds into a kind of there's a performative piece to being a faculty member. There's a performative piece to being a public-facing Christian who people are listening to. There's definitely a performative piece on social media. And I think that all of that pressures us to become personas rather than people. And friendship anchors that and more of a messiness to it all. And so, part of friendship is you realize you don't actually like everything about the other person. It's true of marriage too, right? And you see some of the messiness of other people's lives. There's a really similar process in writing together. When you see a rough draft from someone, you realize, wow, you're not nearly as good as I thought you were, because I saw what's the process that goes into it. And real friendship, I think, exposes the same. And And I think that trust and friendship often follow commitment rather than the other way around. And so I think what Tim and I wanted to do, and actually what I try to do in much of my life, is to say, can we commit and trust that this commitment will be honored and we'll grow from it. And it's anchored a lot of my life. You mentioned my college buddies. We started this our last day of college, so we were 22-year-olds, and we said we're going to commit to being accountable to one another for the rest of our lives, and we're going to commit to asking each other 20 hard questions every 2 weeks and meeting every year. And so we've done that for 25 years now.
Wow.
And it's a gift, but I'll tell you, like, were it not for that commitment, there's no way I'd still be friends with these guys, because we've gone very different ways. And at 22, we all had the same experience. We were friends. We liked the same things. We thought similarly. And 27 years later, we're just we have a shared commitment to Christian faith and friendship and to this thing we're doing. But it's hard, and we've had ups and downs along the way. But it's kept us there, and it's kept us. For me, one of the gifts of that is it's kept us very grounded in just being authentic friends, right? And, I feel somewhat the same about you. Like, I knew you way before you were writing for the New York Times, and I could crack jokes with you, and I think that that's really important. And I think, this is true of pastors too. It's true of anyone in the leadership position. The temptation to become this persona where everybody thinks they know you, and you think you're known, but unless you really work hard on the messiness of friendship, you're probably not known. Mm-hmm. I don't know what that has to do with pluralism, but I really enjoyed saying it.
What I'm hearing, though, is that friendship is a kind of challenge to, only relationships which are based on, ideological conformity, right? Because it sounds like your friends in college, you've all maybe grown apart, grown in different ways, thought differently, and yet you're still, you have a radical commitment to your friendship. I mean, spending money and time with each other every year. And it seems like, friendship, like marriage, oftentimes the successful ones are not, it's not because I recruited you because you think like I do. That would be a very boring friendship.
Right, and in any ministry space, and by that I mean not just a church, but Christian faculty at UT or wherever you are, you look around and you look at, here's the team that God has given you, and at least in my case, I often think this would not be the A team for me. I would have loved half of these people to be here, but I'm stuck with this other half too. But if you're going to do it together, you figure out how to work through the mess of the embodied people around you, and then I think God answers that kind of faithfulness, and then you're not alone in doing it. I think the worst thing for Christians to be is to feel or experience life as if they're the only one in their job or their neighborhood or their friend group, and it can become isolating. But if you can reinforce that you're doing this together, then you're strengthened to continue to press into the difference around you.
How do you feel like, so part of what we're talking about this weekend is how do we as Christians interact with folks that are really ideologically different than us? And I want to be clear that I don't just mean non-Christians when I say that, or people that are outside the church, because I actually think probably all of us have different kind of ideologies, political commitments, and so often, not often, but almost always, when I talk about ideological difference, some of that will be with people who don't claim Jesus at all. So that's one ideological difference. We have a depth of a very deep difference in our understanding of what is true, who God is, how we can know God, if we can know God, if there is a God. Those are things. But we also, just to kind of frame the weekend, often with people in the pews around us who we worship Jesus with, but have deep differences politically, deep differences ideologically, deep differences about, what kind of music we like, the way we want to raise our kids, whether public school or private school, if one of those is evil and one of those is good. All these kinds of And you know, things about sexuality and women in ministry and race and like deeply divisive topics in our culture that are happening, divisions within the church as well. So you talked about how trust kind of often follows commitment as opposed to the other way around. Like I think we think, oh, we like grow to trust and like someone and you know, we like all the same music and they have all the same opinions as I have, and so then we can build a friendship and commitment comes after that. But you kind of said that in a lot of cases, we sort of commit to each other first, and then trust kind of grows from that. So how does that work when we want to hang in there in our church with folks who are different than us, or drive us crazy, or maybe not in our church, maybe our neighbors, right? I mean, like literal people next door to us. But I mean, maybe this is just my observation, this could be wrong, but I often don't see that level of commitment in our culture. I mean, it's, if I disagree with people in my church, I just find another church. Why do I even need to get to know my neighbors, right? Especially if they have a political sign in their yard that I find offensive. Why do I even need to talk to them? So if trust follows commitment, like, first of all, why should we have a commitment to faithful presence? Like, why is that a thing I should be committed to? That seems like a lot of work. But also, how do we cultivate that commitment in a culture that doesn't want commitment?
Mm-hmm. So two things there. One, I think you can't commit to the world or to everyone. So your job as a translator or your job as a Christian living in a world of difference is not to build bridges to every single person in your life. It's just not going to happen, and we're not called to that. So it's prayerfully and strategically choosing the people to whom you're going to commit. And then I think the other part of it is commitment has to be full in this sense. It has to be to the hard and to the trivial at the same time. So if there's someone who's different than you and you say, I'm going to commit to 5 really hard conversations with you, that's doomed to fail, right? If your only relationship is to have hard conversations, it's very unlikely to bear fruit. But if you commit to a person and say, we're going to have some hard conversations, but we're also just going to kill time together, or we're going to have meals or watch a game or walk around the neighborhood with our kids, then in the ordinariness, which you've written much about, the ordinariness of life, you can discover a lot more. You already know what your differences are, and part of your role in relationship is to understand and unpack those differences, but part of the relationship is also to discover the common ground and the similarities that you have with other people. And this is actually, I think the pandemic and Zoom has been devastating for this, because in my world, for example, the academic world is also often like really angry fights for really small stakes, but at least when we could come together for conferences and see people on breaks and actually be forced to talk to these people who think very differently than us, it humanized our adversaries quite differently than Zoom. And now we click, have the really hard conversation, and then click sign off, and that's it. And so we're setting up patterns that are the wrong kind of commitment. It's commitment to disagreement without commitment to relationship.
Yeah. If I could add to that, I mean, I know it's so easy right now to point to social media as like the end of America. But I mean, I will say that it was, I think it was Jonathan Haidt said that if he was charged by, I think he said like the FBI or something, if he was put in charge of creating a machine to break down, to break American democracy, he could not do better than Twitter. Like, he couldn't do better than social media. But I wrote a piece for my newsletter with the New York Times. Please subscribe. I can't remember what it was called, but it started with the line of, it said something like, America's coming apart, we hate our neighbors, we need to talk about the weather. Because there's a survey that I'll probably reference again tomorrow that came out from the University of Virginia, a study where a majority of Republicans, was over 50%, and a large minority of Democrats, it was above 40%, I want to say something like 43 to 45%, said they would be in favor of dividing America by red-blue lines, like seceding into red America and blue America. I don't know what we'd call it. Whatever, but so these two, red and blue team of America.
And then there's Texas. Its own.
We're just seceding. Hey, yeah, but there's T-shirts here that you guys know. I'll tell him that say most likely to secede. I always think that's funny, but anyway, so John, you threw me off, bro. I have a 2-year-old and so I'm really tired. So you can't start talking about secession in Texas. But anyway, so red and blue teams, and David French wrote about this and said, I think he called it something like, there's a whiff of civil war in the air. It's just because the majority of folks were talking about like literally splitting the country along ideological lines. And it's like, that's such a huge scale problem. What do we do? Like, how do we fix that? And so I was, but there's all this kind of data, really, and social theorists, and particularly I was drawing from Jane Jacobs, like the great urbanist advocate, who looks at how building social trust is not usually, like trusting our neighbors is not usually like, let's sit down and talk about our deep differences. It's usually like talking about how, like, what a nice day today is as we're getting the mail, or the barista that you see over and over again, and you just like chit chat with them, and you find out they're in grad school, and you ask them what they're studying, and then next time you see them, you remember what they're studying and say like, how'd your physics test go? You know, like these kinds of little interactions that seem inconsequential, they don't matter, but this is the stuff that slowly builds social trust. And my father, my late father, was a master at this. And he's unbelievable, could sort of be friends with, he had this crazy wide group of friends ideologically. But it's because he could chat about, he would start, you know, mostly it was about like football. And the people like me, his daughter, who weren't into football, he would find something else to chat about, right? Or joke about. And with social media, you don't have any of that interaction. So the immediate thing that you respond to is someone's bio. So you immediately see their religion, you see their political views. We don't usually get on social media and say like, I just had like a great chocolate chip cookie. Some people do, but everyone's like, that's boring, I'm not gonna follow them. Like the things that generate attention and followers is rancor, and it tends to be the most ideologically charged, the most controversial parts of us. So I want to say, like, I think the most important thing about my life is that Jesus has called me his own. I think that's my chief identity. That said, none of us are just a sum total of our religious or political views. We're these whole people that have interest, that have funny things about us, that have favorite foods, and kids get this. I have 3 kids, and they were in the back of a car, in my car today with another kid, and they were like talking about what their favorite foods are. And I'm like, what a lovely way to get to know people. But I never meet new people and say like, what are your favorite foods, right? As like your first thing. But I do think that there's something deeply humanizing about this kind of quotidian, like ordinary stuff that allows us to slowly build relationships. And then all of a sudden we're friends with someone who believes completely different things than us. But it doesn't start by talking about those things. So all that, to go back to social media and Zoom, I think when we interact more and more, where we're not sharing quotidian things like, oh, they moved trash day to Tuesday. Like, that's something we have in common. We may not have anything else in common, but we have that in common.
It's huge. Especially bulk trash.
that we somehow lose that.
What I hear you're saying, though, it kind of maybe helps me understand like why pickleball was such a phenomenon. How many of y'all played pickleball last year at some point? Yeah, like adults playing pickleball all over the country. Have you picked up on this phenomenon? Have you played pickleball?
Heard of it,
Have you played pickleball?
I didn't participate in it.
Well, this is. Well, what I'm saying is that like adults may be aching for more play, maybe aching for more trivial conversations or conversations with your neighbor about bulk trash versus like, hey, did you see the Supreme Court decision today?
Right.
And starting there.
Right.
It's like, yeah, my blood pressure is very high right now. Could you have led with something else? So I think there was a piece in the Vanity Fair about pickleball and the way that it took off in neighborhoods that would draw from very privileged people and also people who lacked resources, and they would meet on the pickleball court, and it didn't matter who you were, you're just there to play pickleball. So it had this kind of like leveling effect, almost like the subway. So I guess what I'm saying is play more pickleball.
No, but there is something, and then you can go, that there's something here about a call back to actual embodied community. Mm-hmm. That our chief interactions can't be with people without bodies in cyberspace where we're interacting with their bio, particularly if those folks have really different ideological, political beliefs than us. That's going to end up being a really rancorous kind of relationship if we're just sort of shooting bombs at people through cyberspace. There's something about actual embodied community, human bodies getting together in the same space, whether that's a neighborhood or a pickleball field.
It's a court.
A court.
Yeah, I think it's a court.
That makes interaction different. And it actually makes trust building possible. And I'm not saying trust building is not possible online, because there are situations we could tell stories of when that's happened. I am saying it's much harder. And I've heard story after story after story of people who the pandemic allowed them, maybe for the first time, to start meeting their neighbors right around them. And I think that kind of reconnecting with actual humans and bodies does help us bridge ideological divides. Do you have agree, disagree?
Well, I just want to say why I think your social media is even worse than you think, because
Great.
Because you said most of us aren't talking about the chocolate chip cookie we just ate, but a lot of people are. The super celebrities are sharing all of these aspects of their lives. So Taylor Swift had a chocolate chip cookie, it goes on social media, and then all of these people around us, and maybe some of us, are connected with that, but it's an artificial, not real connection. And it replaces
the curated cookie.
Or the Instagram experience or whatever it is.
Right.
And so it used to be, when we were growing up, you'd get hit with that, at the checkout counter when you look at the tabloids and you say, oh, here are all the beautiful people doing ordinary things and we feel connected with them. But that was like once a week. And now, like for our kids, it's a constant barrage of that. And the temptation is to think that human need of the ordinary is being replaced by sensing this fake connectivity with the famous people who are eating chocolate chip cookies. So another reason to be, I think, wary of some of the sense of what we experience online. And then to the craving of ordinary conversation. I think that's exactly right. And here's a little trick that has worked well in my life. And if any of you lead meetings or groups of people, for me, it's when I'm teaching seminars or having students to my house, I just start every discussion with an icebreaker question. Has nothing to do with the topic of the conversation, but it's, instead of favorite food, the one that works even better is what's your least favorite food, because passions get high around relatively low stakes issues. Or what's a book you read that changed your life? Or what's a movie that that everybody loves and you really secretly dislike? And these are the kinds of things that get people connected, and you see the eyes darting around the room. And it can happen with, like 5 of your work colleagues, or it can happen with a group of 20 students. But it pauses the hard stuff or the serious stuff to remind us that we're just regular people craving to connect with other regular people.
Yeah.
We should talk about your chapter on writing a little bit more. I know that you probably have some questions for her. Do you want me to start with one, or do you want to? Yeah. You wrote at least your duty as a writer, but also I think this extends to any Christian about communicating to others a meaningful vision of human flourishing. You wrote that. That was, I'm quoting you, a way to know God that makes people long for it to be true. And I'm wondering, who are the examples that you can point to of people who are doing that? Maybe it's friendships in your own life. Maybe it's your relationship with John or people like John. Maybe it's someone who wrote a book a long time ago that you really like. But who's doing that? What examples do you have of that?
Of people who are communicating specifically?
Yeah, communicating that way, that meaningful vision of human flourishing. Who are your examples?
That make me long for it to be true.
Yeah.
It's a really good question. Gosh, that's a great question.
I got it on the internet. I just found it. I just Googled.
Yeah. So, I don't know. I mean, the first one person that came to mind, I'm bringing this book up tomorrow, and I'm now plugging this person's book twice, and that they did not ask me to. But our mutual friend, Andy Crouch, wrote a book called The Life We're Longing For. No, The Life We Are Looking For. I told him to name it The Life We're Longing For, but he didn't. The Life We're Looking For. And it's not out yet. I think it comes out in April or May. But I was reading it. As I was reading it, I just caught myself crying throughout, over and over again throughout the book. And I was like, why am I crying at this book? Because it's not a book about loss. It's a book about human connection and the book of Romans and technology, and it wouldn't strike you as a book. And I realized he names so well the longing of the human heart for connection. And he names our struggle with loneliness so well that I just kept catching myself cry through it. So Andy would be one of those in that book specifically. I am really drawn to writers who had beautiful lives. For me, so I lived in Nashville, Tennessee for a little while, and you get to know a lot of Christian, kind of contemporary Christian music artists, and really quickly I found that there are people who can write beautiful things about God that are just kind of jerks, and whose lives aren't beautiful, right? And so that doesn't mean that what they're saying isn't true or isn't beautiful, but I've just found myself over and over again drawn to people who I felt like were communities formed around them that were focused on more than ego, right? That were focused on something beautiful. And so there's examples of, I bring her up all the time because she's kind of my hero, but Dorothy Day would be a great example. I love her writing. I do. But I also love her life, and I love how she sought to live a really beautiful life and was a writer in the midst of that. John and I both love Rich Mullins, who wrote out of a beautiful life. He was a poet that wrote out of a beautiful life, right? But there are others, folks who communicate. I mean, poets, I think, are amazing at this. Scott Cairns, Malcolm Gwiet, Alden, Dunn, Lewis, right? These folks where I read their stuff and they make me long for the gospel to be true. They make me hope that it's true. I used to say, I think I wrote this in the Uncommon Ground chapter, that if I am struggling with the gospel, wrestling with if this is true, I turn first to apologetics, like N.T. Wright's Resurrection and the Son of God, right? Very helpful, apologetic books. But if I'm really struggling with the gospel, I turn to poetry, because I need someone to remind me that there's beauty that is beyond. There's something about my longing for beauty that's true. That my longing for beauty and truth and eternity and goodness, and for everything wrong to be set right. That's not naive or stupid or privileged. That's actually deeply human, and that it witnesses to something real. And poets draw me back to that. So I feel like a lot of who I could say is poets.
Yeah. But I think that at least the most relatable piece of that is, many of us aren't going to be poets, but the fact that we could communicate with our very lives a meaningful vision.
Oh, absolutely.
So it's not an argument. It's not an argument with your neighbor, right? It's the very fabric of your own life that communicates a meaningful vision of human flourishing, such that they would long for it to be true, even if you don't ever. Because I think, like you said earlier, the key to translation, right, is knowing what it is that you need to translate or talk about. And I think a lot of fear that Christians live with is, I don't know my faith well enough to articulate it. The truth is that they do. It just comes out in embodied forms rather than 3-point arguments.
That's right. And I think we need teachers to help us, to disciple us, so that we can know our faith and so we can explain it well. We need apologists to help us with that. We need good didactic teachers in the church. I'm all for good teaching. And we need poets, right, to give us to cast a vision of truth, goodness, and beauty that draws our hearts in. So I don't want to denigrate that. I'm here representing the writers. So there's such a need for good words. And we can get into this, but words have been so cheapened in our culture that we need the recovery of words. That said, I can tell you as a writer even, what often draws me back to the gospel, back to the truth of Jesus, is people's lives. I have a guy that helped kind of disciple me in college. He's not a writer, but his name's Hunter, and I have caught myself just praying before, could I know the God that Hunter knows? Whoever Hunter is talking about and worshiping, I would like to know that God, because who he's talking about is so beautiful and so loving and so kind. And often I slip into these other versions of God, untruths about God that are not that. And so even just hanging out with him and having dinner with he and his wife makes me go, oh, I would like to know the God that you know. Whatever is going on with you and God, I'd like to get in on that. And so I think that that is actually, in the end, way more important in terms of public witness than our words.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, words are important, and that St. Francis preached the gospel at all times, when necessary, use words. First of all, he didn't say that. It's not St. Francis. I think it's an erroneous quote. But also,
He preaches really well.
But I don't like it very much.
I know. I'm just saying.
Because it is necessary to use words. Like, preach the gospel at all times, and you need to use words. Like, it's really necessary. Words are a huge part of it. I mean, if we didn't need words, then the gospel writers wasted a whole lot of time. So we do need words, but it's just that we need much more than words.
Yeah.
And words are really great gifts for the end of human flourishing in life. Words are not the end. Words are not an end of itself. Our little words are to point to the word, which is Christ's very life, right? Yeah. Not even just Christ's words, but Christ's life. So words are a great tool, but they're limited, and they're a tool.
This is my last question, and then you can take over.
You've got the center seat.
Are there strategic? Are there words right now given the kind of culture wars, the kind of division that we're living with? Are there words that we should strike from our vocabulary?
Yes.
Not dirty words necessarily, but words that are just unhelpful Christian words, theological words, or otherwise. What are those words, and should we set them aside for now?
Yeah.
Adverbs.
What?
Adverbs.
Just complete moratorium on adverbs. Okay.
Woke. If I could delete woke from our collective vocabulary.
You can mute it on Twitter, by the way.
What?
You can mute it on Twitter. It's great.
But if I could mute it in life, I would. Like, if I could just, nobody talks about woke anymore. Because it started, and I know if somebody tweets this, someone will say, like, but woke started as a rallying cry, right? It was like Black Lives Matter activists. Yes, it did. It started that way. And that's valid. It's absolutely valid for communities of folks and communities of protest to, like, form vocabulary about what they're talking about. But it's been so co-opted that now it's often used by the right to mean sort of anything I don't like or feel uncomfortable. And so it ends up just bearing lots of weight, where woke can be Ibram Kendi to like any kind of pastor that calls for, like, racial sensitivity, to like some sort of radical progressive agenda. Like, it just is undefined. It's so undefined that it's unhelpful. And then you have woke, and you have anti-woke, and then you have, like, are they woke enough? And I just hate, I don't like that term. Problematic. So I'm trying to pick on the right and the left, because the right is kind of uses woke. The left is it's problematic. Things are problematic. It's like problematic. Yeah. And I don't like that word, because it feels like it allows what both of these words do is allow people to make statements that are unprecise, that they're not precise, and to not unpack what they mean. Because do you mean sinful by problematic? Like, or do you mean, like, that makes me uncomfortable? Or do you mean, like, because if I say pickleball is problematic, that's a really different statement. That's a really
the pickleball field is problematic.
That's a really different statement than saying, genocide is problematic. Yeah. But both of those terms, the word problematic could apply to. Yeah. And I just think that becomes an unhelpful word.
Yeah.
So when we use words to dismiss something without having to explain what it is, why we dismiss it, what might actually be good about the thing that we're dismissing. So normally, even folks that I mean, this is a really important practice. Even when you deeply disagree with someone, to see that 80-90% of their ideas can be wrong, but that like maybe not 100%. And that's really hard. I mean, I can like hear the voices raising up of like, are you saying that Hitler wasn't 100% wrong? But not every idea you disagree with is Hitler. And I think that part of what it means to not deal with straw men, to deal with what Alan Jacobs called steel men, the strongest version of an argument, is to identify what is good and true about that. And even if, we talked about this the weekend we got together in Uncommon Ground, underneath anger is fear or sadness. So when you see this huge polarization in society and people being really angry at each other, it's worth saying, like, what's the fear behind that? What are they afraid of? Or what's the loss behind that? What's being lost? And then underneath fear and sadness is almost always love. It's almost always something I love, something that's been beautiful or good in my life that I don't want to lose. So for, folks that are more conservative, that could be like the beauty of family or tradition, right? For folks that are progressive, it's the love for justice, a love for, including the marginalized. Like, and that we can affirm, like, I really disagree with a lot of that, but like, get to the love behind it. Like, get to the love that is sort of motivating, even if the logic that extends from that love is totally wrong. But what is it that's sort of the motivating heart in that? So what I'm saying is words like woke and problematic allow us to not name anything good about it and to not even really explain what something is or why we have a problem with it. And I'm fine with condemning things in very strong terms, but only once you really understand it and once you sort of have been able to kind of evaluate the merits of it. And words like that, I think, just allow us to really dismiss too easily. One of the greatest examples, I hope this is okay to bring up again because, like, I didn't ask him, but my friend Wes Hill wrote a review of a book that he hated. And it was really beautiful to watch him as a writer labor over this review. Because he went through draft after draft. I mean, I'm a crazy editor. I will edit until my editor takes a manuscript out of my cold, dead hands. But he just was going draft after draft after draft, even surprising even for me. And he said, it's so much harder to write a good review of a book you hate because he wanted to be so careful to name every single merit that the book had. Mm-hmm. And I just respected that so much because we live in a culture that just wants to slash and burn, right? Just that it's slash and burn is a way of writing where you just tear down the other side. And I've seen people write book reviews like this, and it's much easier. It would be very easy for him to be like, here's why I hate this book, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And he did. I mean, he gave the book 2 stars out of 5, and he explained why he didn't like it. So he wasn't dishonest about that. But he was so gracious about bending over backwards to find every redemptive quality of it. And I feel like the work he put into that made the review so much stronger because it didn't just seem like a pot shot or a tear down. But dismissing something as problematic or woke would have just, that's not what that is. That was a really long answer for that, but.
That's great. We've got about 10 more minutes left. Are there questions? I want to just make sure that if you have questions, that you feel free to ask them. There's a microphone here. Just asked if you would come. If you have a question, to come and line up here to ask it so that those on our live stream can hear the question as well as everybody who's here. So maybe as you're thinking about that, we got a taker. Go ahead.
I'll take this off so I can be heard. Thank you both for being here tonight. It's great. Hi, Trent.
It's good to see you.
Good to see you. I had a question for each. Is that okay?
Great.
Okay. John.
Just not for John.
Yeah, not for me.
Yeah. Oh, I've got one for you too. In your book, you talk about the whiteness of the American church, and it seems like it's shown as a blind spot, that we're, as a white church, not really aware of what that means in terms of how we conduct ourselves and who's welcome and that sort of thing. I also read that your grandparents, I believe, were interned during World War II in the Japanese-American situation. In interviewing, I have a radio program, and I interviewed a local leader named Jennifer Cumberbatch, who's been a leader of reconciliation in our city. And from her, I learned the term generational trauma. And so I wonder, with the whiteness of the church and that internment, how do those things work out? How would you address that in terms of this whole topic of how we relate to each other, how we break down barriers? How do we do that as Christians in this one context?
Well, we are going to turn this into a therapy session. That's a great question. I will say that I'm grateful for a renewed attention to questions of race and racial equity in this country right now. It's very difficult for me to navigate that as a half Japanese American, and I think part of the challenge of being part of a white church in contemporary America is it's very hard even to realize how much the white church has baselined as culturally normal. Mm-hmm. So no one walks into this church and says, hey, there's the white pastor and the white guitarist, and we're singing the white songs, but we are, right? And you might walk into a black church and think, oh, that's a black pastor, and this is a black church. I experienced this. I was part of a campus ministry in college, and at the time, it was almost all white, and I was one of like 4 Asian kids in the ministry. And then for lots of reasons over time, it morphed into a completely Asian group. And they asked me back as an alumni speaker, this is 20 years later, and when I walked into that room, it felt like the Asian ministry, everything, the music, the people, the jokes, and I thought, but why is it like I'm kind of half each here? So why, I never thought of my college ministry as the white ministry. I just thought of it as ministry. But I labeled this as the Asian ministry. And I think for those of us who are part of predominantly white churches, we do that all the time. And it's very hard to get out of that context and say, what is it about my church experience or my faith or the way that I read scripture that is not God speaking to me or God showing his truth through his people, but actually just a result of the culture around me or the people I grew up with. And that's why I think we need lots of help from people who aren't like us, both globally and in the rest of the country.
Thank you. Trish, in your book, you have a quote from a certain Southern author, Flannery O'Connor. And your quote is about how important words are and using the words to fill the story and making every word count, in a sense. And I was thinking about Flannery O'Connor when you talked about the longing for the truth and the beauty and the goodness to be realized. Because at the end of her short story, Revelation, her characters are misfits. I mean, some of them are grotesque, but they're just people that, in fact, one's even called misfit.
Yeah, the misfit. Yeah.
Yeah. So, but I see that longing answered in that beautiful vision of the misfits going into heaven. It's the most. It's hard to find anything in all the literature that touches my heart more than that beautiful scene. But I wonder, since Flannery O'Connor, in fact, there's a Flannery at your house. You could mention too.
Yeah.
But how does she speak to you, and how does she, as an author, speak to us in this pluralistic difficulty that we find ourselves in?
Wow. Oh my goodness, that's I love that you asked me about Flannery O'Connor.
You have 3 minutes.
Are you serious?
No.
So I love Flannery O'Connor. I have, my second daughter is named Flannery Day after Flannery O'Connor and Dorothy Day. So it's two women that worked with words that had beautiful lives. Revelation is my favorite Flannery O'Connor story, and I love Flannery O'Connor. So it's my favorite of the favorites, right? And I can't, for a long time I couldn't read it without just weeping at the end, because it's about this self-righteous religious woman who suddenly realizes that she's at the end of the line going into heaven, and that all these people that she kind of despises are in front of her. And as they go into heaven, they're being healed of insanity and their sinfulness. And it says that as the people like her, at the end of the line, she's writing in the 50s in the racially segregated South. The end of the line was the white, respectable people. And it said that as they walked through, even their virtues were burned away. That there was a purgation, not just of insanity and sin, but of their self-righteousness. And of their whiteness, not in terms of their skin color, but in terms of the supremacy, their assumption of being better because of that was burned away before they could go to heaven. And I just weep every single time because Flannery O'Connor was a sinner, right? And more in the last few years, things have sort of come out about her own racism and prejudice, and that I was like, as someone who named my daughter after her, I was like, should we change her name? Like, what do we? I didn't know. I didn't know. My husband has a PhD in church history, so I came to him and he said, "Well, babe, he knows. Honestly, he knows more about church history than anyone I've ever met. He loves the patristics. His PhD was in 17th century, and he's kind of studied everything in between. And he said, if we need to name our kids out of people who aren't sinners, we're not going to be able to name them anything." So Alice Walker, great Black writer that you guys should read, wrote a beautiful kind of response to this in defense of O'Connor. And what she said is, you don't see in her letters someone proud of her sin. You see in her letters someone wrestling. This is a white woman in the deep rural 50s South, knowing that what she's seeing in her culture is sinful and wrong, and not knowing what to do with that. And so there's this vulnerable wrestling. And you see this in her short stories, particularly Revelation, and this other story, Everything That Rises Must Converge, which deals really overtly with race. So I think what we can learn from O'Connor is first of all, she was just salty in the best kind of way. That was a sassy, salty Southern lady. And what I mean by that is she just had no patience for people putting on airs, people kind of being more sophisticated than she wanted honest talk, plain talk. She was interviewed once, and they asked her if she was a devout Roman Catholic. If she wasn't Roman Catholic, what would she be? And the interviewer assumed it would be something like Episcopalian, something kind of mainline and liturgical and acceptable. And she said, I would be a hot, holy roller Pentecostal. And it's because she wanted the grit wanted the grit and the palpability of the struggle to know God. She had no patience for kind of intellectual posturing. She just really, famously was at a fancy dinner party where they were talking about the Eucharist as this great symbol, like springtime of the resurrection. And she said, well, if it's a symbol, then to hell with it. And because she wanted the presence of Christ, right? And so I think Reed O'Connor, she is not perfect and has all kinds of faults, but she had an insatiable hunger for truth and for God, that even she died very young, very tragically, even as she was dying as a young woman, just continued till her dying day to be hungry for what was real. And I think you see that in her writing.
Can I jump in with one thought tying together the two questions, and back to your point on generational trauma, because it strikes me that we're talking this weekend about navigating deep differences, but it's also a lot about deep pains and histories and reckoning with history. And I think there is a sense of generational trauma and my own Japanese side of the family that traces back to my grandparents losing everything, being in prison for 4 years, my dad born there and raised in poverty, and we're not that far away from the 1940s. But there's also trauma on the other side too, and there's a kind of trauma that comes from reckoning with participation.
Yeah.
And there are people in this room who were alive during segregation, and some people who benefited from segregation. And what does it mean to deal not only with the kind of trauma that is acceptable trauma, right, or sympathetic trauma, but also the trauma that haunts us from other past parts of life.
Of shame.
The trauma of shame. Our friend Warren Kinghorn, who's one of the writers in Uncommon Ground, is a psychiatrist, theologian at Duke, and just a wonderful human being. But he tells the story in his chapter about his grandfather, whom he loved and looked up to, who was a very successful lawyer in South Carolina, who was the lawyer who Clemson University hired to defend it against integration. So now, as he talks about his grandfather, whom he loves, and in whom many ways who has shaped who he is as this successful theologian psychiatrist, and also having to wrestle with that. And that's a kind of trauma too. It's the trauma of shame. It's the trauma of stigma. There's not a kind of a both sidesism here, but it's just, I think, the reality that we're all dealing with some messes we've caused, some messes we've inherited, but that we need to be speaking truthfully and honestly about all of it.
Yeah.
Thanks, Larry. John asked me before tonight what the goal of this, what one of the goals I had for the lectures this weekend were, which was a good question that I should have put some thought into before we put this whole thing together. But what I told him is that one of the things that I take seriously about the job that I have here at Covenant is I really think that I introduce people to things and then kind of get out the back door. And one of the goals that we have for this weekend is if you didn't know about John or Tish or hadn't read any of their books or explored their ideas, that you would be introduced to them, not just as a writer and a translator or as two kind of speaking heads, but as people, as fellow followers of Jesus. So thank you both for having a conversation tonight, for sharing your lives with an audience of strangers. And thank you for listening. And tomorrow we'll have more opportunities for conversation. We'll have more opportunities for questions, any questions that you have. And for any introverts in the room who have a burning question right now, will you guys stick around for a little bit? And if you have a question you want to come up and ask them, you can go ahead and do that. For tomorrow, we'll be back here at 9 a.m. I can tell you that there will be breakfast tacos, so come hungry. There will be good coffee, I promise. And I think that's all I have for tonight. There's books out in the narthex if you guys want to pick one up before you leave tonight or anytime tomorrow. Thanks. We'll see you in the morning.
Thank you.